With over 35 peer-reviewed publications, he has a deep scientific knowledge of air quality, climate and energy systems in Utah and globally. He is passionate about solutions to our air and climate challenges that will improve our quality of life and be essential for our economic future. In addition to climate communication, he will help represent Utah Clean Energy in regulatory dockets and proceeding before the Utah Public Service Commission. William Newmark is a research curator at the Conservation Biologist in the Natural History Museum of Utah. His research is focused on patterns of extinction of bird-based species, protected area and wildlife corridor designs, and animal movement. His finding on patterns of extinction of large mammals in western North American and Tanzanian parks and birds on tropical forest fragments have highlighted the problems that nature reserves face in conserving biological diversity and have provided an important justification for a series of worldwide initiatives to link national parks and related reserves with wildlife corridors. He has been conducting field research for over 35 years in Western North America and East Africa. He has written 2 books and more than 145 scientific papers and technological reports. He has also served as an international consultant in conservation biology to a number of bilateral and multilateral donor organizations, including serving for 20 years as a senior technical consultant on biodiversity conservation to the World Bank. Muskan Walia is a 4th-year student at the University of Utah studying math and philosophy. She is currently the community practitioner in residence with the Environmental Humanities program at the University of Utah. She is a lead organizer at the Utah Youth Environmental Solutions, where she founded a campaign to commit her local school district to 100% clean electricity transition by 2030. Collaboratively designed an environmental justice curriculum for youth across Utah, and is now developing a youth-led water justice campaign to address pressing water management concerns in Utah and the greater Southwest. Today's conversation will be moderated by Lisa Thompson. Lisa has more than 20 years of experience creating exhibits and educational programs. As an exhibit developer at the Natural History Museum of Utah, she researches exhibit topics, conducts audience research, collaborates with scientists and community members, writes exhibit scripts, and produces small digital interactives and media pieces for exhibits large and small. Over the last 4 years, Lisa has been diving into the research on successful climate communication strategies, adapting them to the context of the museum exhibit, and testing the results with museum visitors with the goal of creating an exhibit on climate change that inspires rational hope. She is also the author of a new guide to our local urban nature called Wild Wasatch Front. Please join me in welcoming our guests.
Thank you, Gabby, and thank you all for being here today. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah? Okay, sweet. So I wanted to start out briefly telling you a little bit about some of the work that we've been doing at the Natural History Museum of Utah related to climate communication as a way to tee up this panel. In November, we opened an exhibit called A Climate of Hope, which is a different kind of climate change exhibit. In the past, many climate change exhibits tended to be very data heavy. They focused on stories of people and places that are far away, and they were often pretty grim. But over the last 20 years, the burgeoning field of climate communication research tells us that these approaches aren't particularly effective in helping people learn about climate solutions or inspiring them to be part of them. And so I wanted to go through some of the past frames that we know haven't worked very well based on research, and then tell you a bit about what we're trying to do in A Climate of Hope. And I'm going to be using the word frames to indicate the idea that specific words or phrases or images cue up specific schema in our minds that help us understand the world. And if we want to have different kinds of conversations, different interpretations of climate change, to have more productive conversations, then we need new frames for talking about climate change. So I've first got a list here of some of the common past ways that climate change has been framed in climate communication. And fear has been one of the biggest approaches, and focusing solely on the urgency and the direness of the problems associated with climate change, research tells us tends to elicit negative emotions in people and can result in despair. And the fear frame is often paired with the bleak future frame, and together they just feel overwhelming and cause people to disengage and feel powerless. The argument frame talks about climate change as something that is like either real or it's a hoax, but we know that it deepens political polarization by triggering people's political identities. And when that happens, people aren't very open to learning or very curious about new ideas. This frame tends to reinforce people's existing ideas and encourages them to dig in deeper and bring up arguments that simply defend their existing beliefs. The guilt and sacrifice frame, the guilt frame in particular talks about climate change as an individual responsibility, like reducing your carbon footprint or flight shaming. And it serves to obscure the larger systems that drive climate change and the system level changes that need to be part of climate solutions. And the frame of sacrifice, the idea that climate solutions are going to require us to give up things that we enjoy and that we value, is often the companion of the guilt frame. And we know that it's not very effective in motivating people to action because it conflicts with this really strong psychological desire that we have to avoid loss. The distance frame is the one I mentioned where that frames climate change in stories about places or species or people that seem distant to your everyday life. And that makes it really hard to feel that climate change is relevant to you. And it encourages people to think that the harms of climate change are going to occur in the future to people far away that they don't know. And the more data frame is one that was really common in the past, I think, in museums and in other types of public communications. It focused on presenting scientific facts and data, but there's a lot of research that shows that data is just insufficient to persuade people that climate change is an issue that they should really care about. The research indicates that emotion and identity are really critical in helping people decide what's relevant to them and what's important to them. So in a climate of hope, we are trying to use some different frames. We call them side doors, frames that try to avoid the common traps of these frames that I've outlined for you as a way to engage in more productive conversations that are built around shared values. And so this is a little bit of a taste of what we're trying to do in a climate of hope. One of the large frames that we're using is called rational hope. It's a term that you may have seen the climate scientist Katharine Hayhoe use. And it involves keeping two ideas in tension in your head at the same time. One is the scope and magnitude of the problems that we face, but balancing that with knowing that solutions are available and that there are people all around the world implementing them. This frame also emphasizes the link between hope and action. Hope in this frame isn't simply a wish, but it's a positive feedback loop where action leads to more hope, which leads to further action. And so far, research on the hope frame indicates that it can encourage continued engagement, and we also hope that it can help visitors feel like they can be an effective part of climate solutions. The community frame talks about solutions through community and at the community level, which can lead to more impactful solutions and change at a systems level. So rather than blaming individuals for their lifestyle choices, like the guilt frame, this frame focuses on actions that are personally relevant and achievable for people that they can take in groups that they are already part of or that they can join. And so we think that this is a way, again, to help people see how they can be part of meaningful climate solutions. We also use the frame of community to appeal to a visitor's sense of belonging that includes groups with a variety of political identities, like Utahns or Westerners. The Better Future frame is an alternative to the sacrifice and the fear and bleak future frame. It posits that it's within our control to create a better future that addresses climate change and that would result in many co-benefits, like abundant affordable energy, healthier communities, clean air, sustainable agriculture, more access to nature. And research shows that motivational frames, having something positive to strive for, are better at engaging people than sacrificial frames. We also, as an alternative to the distance frame, firmly root a climate of hope in Utah. It uses a local frame to situate climate impacts and climate solutions in the context of familiar landscapes and communities and organizations. And we think that this frame can help visitors find ways to personally connect to stories about climate change in ways that are relevant for them. And research shows that that narrowing psychological distance can support engagement and lead to a greater concern and reduce ideological polarization. And then our final frame is meeting people where they are. And in contrast to the more data frame, this frame helps people discover how climate change is relevant in their lives by connecting climate change to issues that they already care about. The frame draws on people's it respects the ideas and values that they're bringing to the exhibit, and it utilizes language that's welcoming and inclusive. In prototyping for a climate of hope, we found ideas like air quality, health, caring for community, providing a hopeful future for children, and stewardship all showed really great potential as bridges between climate change and issues or values that Utahns already cared about. So I don't want you to leave you with the impression that we have this all figured out. This is very much something that we're testing. And in fact, we have an NSF grant to do research on the exhibit, and the first phase of it is just about wrapping up. We've set up people with voice recorders and GoPros and turned them loose into the exhibit, and we're going to be analyzing the transcripts of what they've said to see if these frames are effective. And we'll be publishing the results of that research and hopefully sharing out more broadly with the museum community and with educators in general to see if these frames are shifting conversations around climate change. But with that as a frame for this discussion, I wanted to open it up to our panelists to see if any of you wanted to comment on how you communicate about climate change in your work, what tactics seem to be working for you to be balancing hope and urgency. And maybe, Esther, can we start with you? And maybe you can tell us a little bit about how art plays into your role working climate communication.
Yeah, I think as you were speaking to, the arts and humanities have a huge role in connecting people to stories about what climate change means in their actual lives and in the world in general. And that personal connection can happen through the space of art, both art making and art observation. So I try to use both of those things. I definitely make art about climate that I hope ends up in situations where people can start dialogues drawing from that art about the specific themes that I'm bringing up and what climate can mean in their own lives and how they can explore that, but also through workshops and community art making, which just gives people an entry point to start thinking about those questions in a different way. And I think having a little bit of room for like play around the topic and creativity makes it more accessible to start with, and also taps into like the emotional, spiritual, psychological parts that aren't necessarily hit as hard by the data side.
Yeah. Ms. Gahn, do you want to talk to us at all about how climate communication plays a role in your work?
Yeah. So as you had mentioned, I'm an organizer with Utah Youth Environmental Solutions, and something that we have worked on is an environmental justice training program. So something that we had realized was happening in Utah was there was really powerful youth leadership. One of the big things that we did was pass HCR 7, which was Utah's first acknowledgement of climate change, and we wrote and passed that resolution. But then we had realized that like young people's lives are very transient, right? Like we're getting new jobs, we're going to college, et cetera. And so to be able to sustain that leadership and to bring people in, particularly young people, we needed education. So we developed this curriculum in collaboration with the Environmental Humanities program, where one of their students was sort of doing research on like what brings young people in, what motivates them, what compels them to act, and then built a curriculum off of that for 14 to 17-year-olds. So the way that we the things that we had found from those interviews and the way that we've structured our program is we start with sort of identity. So we spend like 2 days basically like connecting the group, helping each of the young people understand like what connects them to the environment, like what parts of their identity connect them to the environment. And this like first couple of days starts to tie environment issues to social issues. And that's kind of the goal of the program, is that they're both interlinked. And so after we've sort of created that connection, we then talk about how we got to the situation that we're at. So we go into like history, we talk about systems, just social systems that have gotten us here, and then talk about the ways that people have chosen to live sort of outside of this system, or like live in different ways that are, honor stewardship. And then we have a final chapter, which is where do we go from here? So, or how do we get there? So they take all of that information. So they take their connection to the environment, their connection to their community, they take the history, and they take sort of these like case studies from everywhere of different ways of life, and then they get mentored through a process of planning and action. So that kind of like combines, I mean, we've heard and done a lot of surveys where our young people are like, I'm getting exposed to this in school in a way that's like very, like they talk about it in assemblies, but they don't tell me what to do. And that has like led to anxiety that's almost crippling. And so the thing that we have kind of done is give them historical context in a way that's like empowering, because then we help them do an action, and then we like kind of bring them onto our campaign. So we've got education, we've got water, and we've got clean energy, and sort of take the skills that they've learned and then act on it. So we've kind of like combined the three things, identity, education in a way that's like appropriate and also empowering, and then doing something with that education.
Yeah, that's really exciting to hear that. I think you're working on creating that feedback loop of action, hope, exactly. Moving forward. Yeah. Logan, do you want to tell us at all about climate communication in your work?
Yeah, I think one of the themes that I've been trying to emphasize is exactly what you're saying, balancing and understanding both the urgency and opportunity of our current position. And so I have a background as a climate scientist, and I understand the climate system in a way many people don't. And so try to communicate and make accessible and the seriousness of the challenge and where we're headed and where we're at now. That gives you a sense of the urgency and how it impacts the world, and also how it localize those impacts here in Utah. But then also understand there's also an opportunity side of this. We're in the midst of a global energy transition that is at the scale of the Industrial Revolution, but instead of it playing out over a century, it's going to play out over a couple of decades. We're already in the middle of it, and the next couple of decades are really critical. We're going to see the face of the world change, and how we get our energy, where we get it from, and how we operate in the world. It's actually really exciting, and there's tons of opportunity, and there's tons of work that's needed. And helping people understand the scope of that opportunity is a really critical piece of the puzzle, and then encouraging people to not spend all of their time in either the urgency or the opportunity spheres. Because if you spend too much time in the urgency, then you feel despair and disempowered. But if you spend too much time in the opportunity sphere, then you think like, oh, technology is going to take care of it. We don't need a sense of urgency. So balancing those two things and having a healthy tension there can help provide the basis for action.
Yeah. Bill, how does climate communication play a role in your work?
Well, I've worked in East Africa most of my professional career in Tanzania. And Tanzania is one of these mega biodiversity countries. And I've been working in this series of mountains in northeastern Tanzania. And these mountains are called the Eastern Arc Mountains, and they have the highest ratio of endemic species. That is, species are only found there to area of any place in the world. But the forests are highly fragmented. Okay, so I initiated this study almost 40 years ago, looking at the population and community dynamics of these birds. Then all of a sudden, something emerged on the horizon that we really weren't thinking about, or I wasn't thinking about, and that is climate change. So the first question is can we actually pick up a signal of climate change? So the last 4 or 5 years, we've kind of expanded our focus And not surprisingly, we're picking up a very, very strong signal in terms of climate change. So then the point became, okay, what can we do about it? Okay, and so at that point, we've been, as most scientists, we write technical papers for our colleagues, but in Tanzania, where I work, it's very important not to actually expand the audience with whom you're communicating. And so there is an environmental organization there that has a newsletter that's very widely read in the country. So I started writing a series of popular articles highlighting what we found and what we can do about it. Now, the good news is that by regenerating forest between these isolated blocks of forests in East Africa and Tanzania, you can have a tremendously positive impact on persistence time, both as a result of fragmentation and because of climate change. So here is one thing that will simultaneously address both problems. And what we show is, in fact, by strategically regenerating forests between the largest and closest forest fragments in these mountains, you can have a tremendous impact on persistence time. In fact, you can increase persistence time by 65-fold, which is almost unheard of. And
Bill,
the reason,
can you tell us what persistence time is?
okay, persistence time is how long a species will last over time. So what is the survivorship? Expressed in terms of time or number of generations, okay? And all species will eventually go extinct, okay? But what happens is that when you fragment, there's a very rapid decline in population. But when you reconnect, there's also an enhancement in survivorship or persistence time, okay? So I wrote, and some Tanzanian colleagues, we wrote these articles, and the government says, oh, we didn't know whether or not climate change was actually affecting biodiversity in Tanzania. And so what we're doing now is that we are starting to actually regenerate forest in these critical gaps. And we're involving local communities in this. It's all done but locally. My job is simply to raise money. Their job is to actually implement it. And so we involved anywhere from 40 to 60 people from villages immediately adjacent to these gaps. So they're responsible for collecting seeds, germinating the seeds, and then transplanting the seedlings to these gaps and then tending the seedlings. So this is actually very popular within these communities. It's now very popular within Tanzania. And once again, it addressed this larger objective of reforestation, because that is one of the easiest solutions to addressing the issues of climate change. So I will stop there. But yes, this popular article was picked up, and those are the articles that are more likely to be read by decision makers than those that appear in some scientific journal.
Oh, that's fascinating, Bill. I hadn't heard you tell that story before.
Yeah.
So let's shift gears a little bit and talk more specifically about projects or actions that you are aware of or have been involved in that you think have been particularly effective. Well, I'm going to go back to you, Esther, because I know you have something exciting coming out this Friday.
Yeah, I have been working on a project with 10 local artists and with the nonprofit Assist, which is a local community design center, on a project called Imagining Futures. So we had an open call for artists and selected 10 other artists that I've been working with. We started by just having a lot of conversations together about what community means to us and what universal design and climate adaptive design can look like. Universal design being a philosophy around design that says that accessibility should not come as like an afterthought to design processes, but how we design from the beginning should be inclusive of all people, including disabled people. And so we started by having sort of very abstract conversations and thinking about how this moment of transition that we have to make around climate is also an opportunity to create better futures for our communities. So then all of the artists split off and made work that engaged with the conversations we've had. And that work came together into an artist book, which is being launched on Friday, 6 o'clock in the Alumni Center. If you want a copy of the book, it will be there. And that just was a really great opportunity to engage with a lot of different perspectives on this question of what are we building towards, as opposed to just what are we losing. Because I think framing it that way gives people that sense of hope as well as retaining some of the urgency, because it maintains the sense that we do have to build towards something different, while also imagining how that can be exciting and generative. So that has been a really exciting project to work on, and ties into a lot of those artists are involved in other local projects, because they're especially around Great Salt Lake, but around climate change and environmental issues in general. There are just a ton of artists in Salt Lake City working on different projects, some of which I'm involved in and some of which I haven't been, and getting to bring those people together into one space to work together was really exciting.
What do you hope might be some of the ripples that happen once this book is launched?
Yeah, I'm hoping that it's a project that can actually continue, that we can keep working with more artists, and the artists that have already worked together can keep collaborating. There is a whole school of scholarship and design called Transition Design, which is focused on this exact question of, given the many entangled problems that we're facing right now, both in specifically climate space, but also in social justice, what is the transition that we're gonna make, and what is that too? And so I'm hoping that Imagining Futures will be a way of accessing that through the world of art and design. So putting the books out into the world as a starting point for conversations, and then continuing to gather cohorts of people, both in these more formal design cohorts, as well as I'm hoping to do like workshop spaces locally. That's something I've been involved in, a lot of zine and collage workshops, some focused around climate and some just general, but giving people a space to access the ideas that have already started in the project, as well as explore their own ideas through art making and conversation.
It sounds super exciting. Bill, maybe let's come back to you. And could you tell us a little bit about your work with wildlife corridors? And I was thinking about how they might help animals adapt as the climate is changing.
Okay, so I've been interested in corridors for a long time, and I've very recently looked at the value of establishing corridors between the largest Western North American parks, once again on persistence time, as well as looking at the value of regenerating this forest between gaps or corridors on these bird communities in Tanzania. And as I mentioned, that if you allow, the value of this reconnection or corridors is that you allow species to shift their range over time, because they will in response to climate change. But if there are significant gaps, and these species cannot shift their range either elevationally or latitudinally, okay? So in North America, most of the corridors that we were looking at between Yellowstone and Glacier, and between Mount Rainier and North Cascades, those would allow movements both latitudinally as well as elevationally in some cases. And that's exactly the same thing in Tanzania. Because we're working in mountainous areas, there is a large elevational range between the lowest and the highest forests. So if you can reconnect those, you will permit species to move upslope over time. Now, the importance in Tanzania for this, you think of birds as being very good dispersers. Yeah, they can fly. Well, what's amazing about these tropical birds is that they evolved under continuous forest cover. So a gap of 30 or 40 feet is a barrier to movement. Even though physically, you can take them out, release them, they'll fly back, but psychologically, they'll never cross that gap. So they need continuous forest, okay? But there's also a whole series of other organisms, such as whole series of lizards, iguanas, chameleons, series of bees, believe it or not, are very poor dispersers. So, and then, primates, arboreal primates, they're not going to jump down on the ground very often. So this will permit species, once again, to more readily shift their range. But the other advantage of these corridors is that you actually expand the size of the population. So you address the problems of fragmentation while addressing this issue of allowing species to shift their range in response to climate change. And I should mention that there's all these studies that documented that species now are shifting their ranges in response to climate change, not only in our study site, but also we know that these gaps do inhibit the movement of species. So once again, this is we think, a win-win solution to address the two most greatest threats to biodiversity, and that is fragmentation and climate change.
And is there progress happening on the Yellowstone to Glacier or Rainier to North Cascades corridors?
People okay, so what has happened to date is that people realize, oh, these parks aren't large enough, and so you have a lot of groups that, for instance, the Greater Yellowstone Coalition. Well, that is restricted to about 50 miles around the park itself. But what we now know, actually, we need much larger areas. Okay, we need to not only expand that, but we need to expand it all the way to Glacier. Okay, and so it's interesting that you mentioned this, Lisa. So I met last week with the head of the Wildlands Network here, that's based here in Salt Lake City. That's, this person had exactly the same question that you had. Are people working on this? And if not, why not? Okay. And part of it could be that you're working in a larger area. Financially, it's more expensive. You have to bring in, obviously, more stakeholders. And, strategically, the decision may be, okay, we're going to work in the smaller area initially. And that's what we're doing in Tanzania. We decided, the most challenging thing is that many of these gaps are actually on private lands, okay? So we decided, okay, we want to demonstrate that we can regenerate forests, but we're going to work within existing national parks or protected areas there. So we can demonstrate that, yes, we can regenerate forests, and we can, in fact, we've regenerated 120 hectares, which is about 250 acres in the last 3 years. And so this is kind of a proof of concept that it can be done. We can do it using local communities, and local communities are very supportive. And we know these birds well enough. We know their idiosyncrasies, that we know that, yes, these corridors will work. And there's been work from other places around the world where people have allowed forests to regenerate and monitored what's happened. And sure enough, within 2 or 3 years, they're moving back and forth. So, this is something that, we're very confident will be effective.
Wonderful. Muskan, would you talk to us a little bit about what gives you hope in your work in environmental justice?
Yeah. I'll start with progress. So something, and yeah, I don't know, just like self-promotion, I guess. So we have our 3rd annual environmental justice training program that has launched, and the application is now open for this summer. So if you all know any 14 to 17-year-olds, tell them to apply. So that is really fun. I think second thing is like just seeing, the program has now been happening for 2 years, and we've had almost every single graduate joined one of our campaigns. And so sort of building on momentum from past leaders where we had like a resolution, 100% clean energy resolution passed in Salt Lake City School District and Park City School District and Davis School District, and now working on Granite School District, and like kind of outreaching to places in Utah that like aren't so central to Salt Lake City, like going out to more rural areas, connecting with those students and like seeing if they're motivated or compelled to start a campaign in their school district is really exciting. And the development of this water campaign is really exciting. We're doing it in collaboration again with the Environmental Humanities Program. And so it's really thrilling to kind of think about the ways that this like academic institution or this program in an academic institution can sort of use the things that they're really good at and the things that the students are really good at, and pair it with these young people's ideas and like what they want to see as, you know, with the Great Salt Lake and the future of the Great Salt Lake, and have it come together to be sort of like a really powerful collaboration that lends to something that kind of changes the way that we organize and the way that environmental organizing happens in the state. So I think that's really exciting. I think also like it's just really thrilling to talk to the young people that we get to work with and just sort of see, yeah, just like the despair that they feel in their schools and with their peers, and then kind of share with us as organizers that like they finally realize that the way that they were thinking doesn't have to be the way that they think, and we're so grateful that we're able to sort of open that up for them. And then they take it to their schools and share it with their friends, and their friends sign up for the program. And so it's created incredible momentum, and I think that that excites me. And I'm also really excited because there's kind of an increase or excitement about talking about environmental issues through a social lens. And so sort of pairing the two, I feel like the narrative in Utah has always been like a very it's like a pretty it's the same story that, you know, from people that have been able to enjoy the outdoors. And so I'm excited that people are sort of more interested in now the social lens, or the sort of different story, which is the story of justice. So, yeah.
Thanks, Ms. Gahn. Logan, you get to bring it home. It's been a little rough lately in the world of clean energy, but maybe can you tell us, help us see the bigger picture, and yeah, what you think is particularly effective, what you're excited about.
Yeah, there's some recent developments in Utah. We've had a series of setbacks in this last legislative session and with our utility, but beyond that, there's actually still a lot of really good things happening. It's almost hard to even know where to start, but there have been a bunch of federal bills that have passed that have allocated a lot of money into this space. And those dollars for building capacity for planning and implementing climate solutions are rolling out to all the states right now. The states just recently, we have a climate action plan. The Beehive emission reduction plan is getting rolling. There's going to be a Solar for All announcement here very, very soon, which is going to help make rooftop solar more accessible for mid and low income families. There's all kinds of incentives for retrofitting or installing new electric appliances. There's just so many things that are happening, and a lot of resources have been mobilized to start making these changes in our communities. It's really, really exciting, and there's just a lot of stuff going on. It's in some ways, it's like drinking from a fire hose. And so that's great. You know, those are really positive things that are happening. One of the things that I'm most excited about, I work in the electric utility space, so understanding electricity markets. One of the most exciting things I think is happening right here in Utah with the advancing of enhanced geothermal electricity, and there's a little part about that in the exhibit. It's really exciting to be able to, essentially it's like an industrial scale ground source heat pump, but you can drill a hole and then drill another hole and connect them, and then you can pump water through it and harvest the heat energy from basically anywhere. And it has enormous potential, and There's just starting to be the first little bits of investment in it at the scale of that we need. But it's happening in Utah, and it's a really exciting. I think in 10 years from now, you'll look back and this will be one of the things that people are talking about all the time. So that's really exciting, and it's really exciting to see that innovation happening in Utah. And I guess just the general pace of innovation is just astronomical. It's like, if you think about the prices of clean energy technologies, if you're not checking up on them every 6 months, you have outdated information, because the pace of learning, and as we scale deployments, the costs are coming down, and it's just really astounding. Things that would have seemed impossible 10 years ago are now the least cost, most obvious solution. So thinking about where we're going to be 10 years from now, it's hard to imagine the kinds of things that are going to be available, because that's the pace of innovation. And it's really hard for people who are kind of set in their ways. In generalizing, older folks at companies and institutions, like, oh, this is how we've always done it. Well, things are changing, and it requires a flexibility and openness and being mindful of innovation and new ways of approaching things. And so often companies, I talk to a lot of different folks in companies, and they're often looking to their younger employees for creative ideas about new ways of doing things that may have been different than the way they've done it before, that might actually lead to reduced costs and better products and better service for folks. So that's just really exciting to see that playing out in real time. And things are changing so fast that it's like over a course of a few years, we're seeing institutions change, businesses change, new business models open up. So it's a really exciting time.
Yeah, and maybe I'll just pick up on that as a final comment. So Logan mentioned that there's a section about enhanced geothermal in the exhibit. And what's really exciting is it's outdated, because the exhibit's just open, but that's how fast things are changing. The exhibit features a research project based here at the University of Utah that was basically like a proof of concept, like we can make this affordable. And they did, and like a half mile down the road now, there is a commercial plant that is implementing this technology, and the exhibit is still talking about it as like a research proof of concept. And there's other parts of the exhibit that are meant to be updatable just because we know, and that was the most hopeful, sorry, microphone people, most hopeful part of the exhibit for me was just being able to talk to people all around the state, in every corner of the state, that are working on so many exciting projects. We have a little section where we feature 12 of them, and it's just not enough. And so we plan to switch those out on a regular basis so we can continue to highlight the amazing work that's going on all around the state. So with that, should we open it up for some Q&A? Love to have your questions for any of the panelists.
If you raise your hand, I can bring the microphone over.
Hello. I've recently been learning a lot about trust in science communication and how important it is. So I was wondering if any of you have experiences or strategies to teach or inform the skeptics or those who aren't open to this conversation yet, noting that change will happen regardless.
Yeah. I think it's really important to find, as you're approaching folks, to find common ground. Find something that they care about and start from there. And that's why I think it's really important to understand the sense of urgency and opportunity, because as I'm talking to people, I find typically people who understand the issue and are engaged in this issue fall into one of the two camps, or fall more predominantly in one of the two. And I'm starting to realize that if somebody is predominantly in the sense of urgency, then they need to hear the story about opportunity. But if I don't stop and let them know that I understand their deep sense of urgency, then they're not going to trust me to then have that next conversation. So it's important to find common ground to build rapport. And it's also true for folks who aren't engaged in this topic right now. There's a lot of fear and uncertainty and feeling like things are being mandated from on high. And there's folks who, frankly, have been exposed to misinformation and don't have a good understanding of what's actually happening. And for those folks, it's important to engage them. I mean, I think Catherine Hayo talks about this quite a lot, about you're a human, you live in the world, you want to leave the world a better place for our kids, you want to be a good steward of our resources. And so there are other strategies for engaging that maybe go in the side door and don't engage because if you just throw data at them and approach the topic head on, sometimes that can lead to a retrenchment. And so that's where talking about history often will get around kind of the frontal question. Because I often find that when people have concerns like, what happens when the sun doesn't shine? That's actually not their concern. Their concern is about something deeper that they're worried about. And if you just try to address it head on, then you're not actually addressing their root question. Or like, EV can't drive far enough. They're actually worried about change in technology and just general anxiety or mandates. And so it's just a different conversation. And so understanding where people are coming from is really critical with communicating about anything. It's just a general life skill, but it's especially important in this space when there's so much change happening. And change is hard. Change is really uncertain. And we don't have all of the answers right now. And it requires creativity and envisioning a new future. And that's uncomfortable for a lot of folks.
Something that I wanted to add after you were talking that people have done to us and that we do to people is in the movement, there's a lot of othering. So there's like the classic example with the Great Salt Lake is that like farmers are bad. And so we just kind of other them, leave them out, or like a certain side of a political party is bad. And so I think like acknowledging that othering or the fact that they have been othered and then like figuring out a way using your tactics into the movement, I think sort of helps build trust because it kind of acknowledges the fact that you see that they have been othered or that like they're the problem that's kind of fracturing the movement or like not contributing to the movement. And so showing that you're aware of that and that you're like trying to bring them in, I think also restores a lot of trust.
And I think to that point about accessing what people's real concerns are about and where their entryway is something that art and writing are really good at. Also to your point about popular writing being a good entry point for people, there's a lot of research that shows that like more and more data doesn't really convince people who are already not convinced by the data that exists, whereas accessing a more emotional and personal side does give an entry point and I think allows for some of those divides that you're speaking to, Muskan, to like break down a little bit.
I guess I would mention a little bit based on my experience working with the World Bank. World Bank is very, very sensitive to opinions of the taxpayers that support the bank. The bank is a development organization, actually. It's the largest development organization in the world. But in response to global concern about climate change, almost the highest project priority now in the World Bank is to address this emerging issue. So it's the kind of the activist voice that have been raised around the world is something that they do respond to.
Other questions?
So obviously at this point in our evolution as a species, we're many years past being a species that are hunter-gatherers. We live in a developed world. How do we find a balance between development and the natural world?
Well, that's the central challenge facing the World Bank. And that's a central challenge of anybody working in a developing country. It's the conflict between development and conservation. And I won't go into this long story, but I was also working on another project with a critically endangered species of toad that became the test case for the World Bank, whether or not their development activities will lead to the extinction of a species. And when the project started out, it was incredibly unpopular in Tanzania. They had political cartoons saying it's easier for these spray toads to travel first class in an airplane ticket to the US than for our Tanzanian. But 10 years later, it was the highest ranked project within Tanzania. So you can, attitudes change, and so now Tanzanians are incredibly proud of this project there because they've been actively involved throughout the entire project. But yes, that's the issue. It's, I think the important point is it's the cumulative impacts over time. It's just not development here, there. It's the cumulative impacts that we have to be particularly concerned about. And, but in, the developing world, these tensions are much more obvious. I can't blame somebody for going into the forest to cut it down if they have to feed their family, okay? On the other hand, they and everyone else is dependent on water. And so there is this continuous tension. And the solution is to find alternatives where people aren't forced to do these things to survive.
Muskan?
Yeah, I don't know if in my brain it's about balancing. I think it's prioritizing conservation. I think something that I've learned through the development of the curriculum is that, and just like talking to people working on the Great Salt Lake is like, because we were trying to balance development or we prioritize development, it's kind of gotten us to this situation, and like these systems convince us that we just keep needing development, and or kind of like at this point of no return where we have to shift our priorities to be conservation. And yeah, and I completely agree with you that like these systems have put people in places where they need to provide, like they need to develop in order to provide for their families, but this like just transition that we're talking about is trying to give these people a different source of providing that doesn't require like developing the natural world. So yeah, I'm not sure it's balancing anymore. I think it's like prioritizing conservation at this point because we tried to balance and development took the priority.
And I think to that point also, like there are many ways of being in relationship to like the human world and the more than human world, and our current system of like Western colonial constant expansion is one way of being, but there are many other models in the world. And I think that's one of the powers of working in community is like nobody has every answer, but if we work across differences and across groups, we have many more answers that we can orient towards a different way of being.
And fundamentally, if you think about it, if you just take a step back and think about the concept of endless growth, eventually we will hit physical limits. Like it is impossible to have endless growth forever on a finite planet with finite resources. And I think that in the coming few decades, we're going to be facing some of those limits. And climate change is one manifestation of that. It's, in my opinion, the most serious near-term manifestation of that. That's a threat to organized societies, organized, complex, interdependent societies across the globe. But there are others, microplastics and other sources of pollution in the environment that we would need to solve. And we need to come up with new understanding of being, and there's a justice component to that, because if you're just fighting for survival, then you can't think about the greater system. And so it will be, I'm very interested to see what happens in the next few decades as we're going through this process and understanding physical system limits and charting a new path. I don't know what that looks like. But it's going to be really interesting, and it's going to take all of us to come up with solutions. None of us has a solution on our own, and leveraging community for solutions, and I think it's really important.
Do we have time for one more question?
Yeah,
or do
it
we
looks
need
like
to
we have
wrap
time
it
for
up?
one more
Okay.
question. If anyone has one.
Hi, thank you all so much for being here. It's been great to hear from all of your perspectives. My question is, we are here in Utah, and like we've mentioned before, sometimes it feels a little limited in the goals that we want, specifically in terms of climate change. And maybe that's efforts towards clean energy, maybe that's efforts towards conservation of the Great Salt Lake. And it's important to recognize some of those powers that are above us, but I'm interested also in hearing from all of your perspectives on what actually makes this community a good place to be in the face of climate change, or why does this community have opportunity that maybe other places don't have, or like what makes this place strong in the face of climate change?
I can start. So I think something that makes our community in Utah really strong is, particularly with grassroots groups, is the fact that like you were mentioning these kind of powers above us, like the fact that we accept different ways of mobilizing around the environment. So like lobbying is one way, thank you so much, but also it's like not the only way, and allowing people to kind of enter into the movement the way that they want and with the skills that they have, and like kind of strategically thinking about where they fit in and letting them fit in, kind of sustains the movement here in Utah, because we don't just believe that like our lawmakers are the like end all be all, but there's other ways to make change beyond just like a legislative thing. So I think that's really powerful in keeping us going and sustaining the movement.
Well, as a biologist, I can say there are few states in the U.S. that has more public lands. And these are the areas that are most important, particularly the riparian regions and public lands. So we are incredibly fortunate. And if you've lived in places in the east, you can't just get up and start walking, from this building up in the foothills. It's all private land. So, we're incredibly fortunate here.
Yeah, and I think I moved here from New York, and a difference that was immediately apparent to me, aside from the presence of public lands, is a strength of a counterculture here that is very interconnected. I come from a giant city where there's tons of different fragmented communities happening, and I think a benefit of a smaller city is there is a lot of interconnection that I see, for example, in the art community, of people being able to work together. And so I think combined with where we are and the access to public lands, that more integrated community that is partly a resistance to like political powers is a real strength happening here.
And one of the things that I worked on is I was a professor here at the U in the Atmospheric Sciences Department before I joined Utah Clean Energy, and I worked on the history of air quality in Utah and published a paper on that and helped with a digital exhibit about that. And one of the things that I have realized from that work is that Utah actually has a really long history of working on environmental challenges, and there's a closeness to the edge of environmental challenges and the proximity to it. Like, we can see the air quality, we breathe it in, we feel it. And you go to many other places and that's just not apparent. The air quality challenges are different, they're not as present. The water challenges are not as visible. And so I think that because of our proximity, because of our environment, because we have access to natural areas, I think there's a greater awareness of the importance of those areas and importance of conservation and stewardship that you just don't see in other places. And it is a work in progress, but there is also a lot of conservative climate leadership in the state that is actually really exciting, starting to change that narrative and actually, I think, recapture some of the narrative that was present 100 years ago in the state. And we have this really strong legacy, actually, of environmental stewardship, of working towards environmental stewardship. And if we can recapture that, then we can show a way out of kind of the political division that's around environmental solutions in a way forward that is more in harmony, across political diversity, and that is, I think, an important piece of the way forward. Because if we're just doing it on one side of the aisle, it's not a complete solution and it's not durable. So we need to bring all of these folks together. Even if they disagree, we need to find ways to find agreement. And I think that that's what is a big message of the Climate of Hope, is finding those pathways forward and making it work, because we all need to reach that destination together.
Yeah, and maybe just to build on that idea and wrap things up there, is a series of video interviews in A Climate of Hope where we talk to different people around the state about the climate challenges that they're facing. And some of the people we talked to didn't even really want to use the words climate change. They weren't comfortable with that, but they were so passionate about the land that they were connected to or the community that they were a part of, and realized that things were changing and are passionate about making sure that the land they're stewarding, that the community that they're a part of can continue to thrive, and are open to having, talking about solutions and paths forward with anyone who has ideas to share. So with that, I think thank you all so much for coming. Thanks to our amazing panelists for sharing all your expertise and wisdom with us. And thank you for being here. Yeah, it's an exciting time to be part of a rapidly changing world. So thank you.